Hello and good evening. I'm Teresa Munoz, Research Associate at the Newcastle Centre for Literary Arts, a creative writing research centre based at Newcastle University. At NCLA, we run a term time event series featuring novelists, poets, nonfiction writers, and screenwriters from all over the globe. And we are so pleased tonight to be hosting Torrey Peters in conversation with CJ Hauser. This event came about through the Pass the Baton speaker series that we do. First, there was Helen Lewis, who then nominated Charlie Gilmore, who did an event with them, and then who nominated CJ Hauser. And then for tonight, CJ has chosen Torrey for what promises to be a brilliant and insightful event. And I am especially excited as I enjoyed this book immensely. So I'll begin by introducing CJ Hauser, who did, as I said, our wonderful event with us last October. CJ Hauser's full first length of nonfiction, The Crane Wife and Other Essays, is forthcoming from Viking UK in spring 2022. Her novel Family of Origin was published by Doubleday in 2019, and her debut novel, The From Aways, was published by William Morrow in 2014. Her work has also appeared in Tin House, Narrative Magazine, The Paris Review, Tri-Quarterly, Esquire, Third Coast, The Kenyon Review, The Guardian, and The New York Times. She holds an MFA from Brooklyn College and a PhD from Florida State University and teaches creative writing and literature at Colgate University. I'll leave it to CJ now to carry the event.
Hi, I'm so excited to be back with this series. Torrey, I'm so excited you're here, and I will introduce you. Torrey Peters is the author of the novel Detransition, Baby, which we're going to be talking about today, published by One World, which won the 2021 Hemingway Award for debut fiction, which is like exciting news. It was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Awards, a finalist for the Brooklyn Public Library Award, and was longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction. A collection of 4 novellas titled Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones will be published by Random House in 2023. She has an MFA from the University of Iowa and a master's in Comp Lit from Dartmouth. Torrey rides a pink motorcycle and splits her time between Brooklyn and an off-grid cabin in Vermont. And I want to say too that I love this book just personally, but also what I love the most about books that really sing to me these days is that I want to talk about them with everyone I know. And in my writing group, we have a year-end check-in that we do on New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, and we have like a series of questions we answer every year. And then one of the questions is like, what is the thing that you read this year that sort of like, I don't know, rearranged you the most, the best? And normally we fight about it because we have very different tastes, but this year, all of the women in my group, we all had, it just became a book club for Detransition, Baby. And so I think it's a book that I love to talk about with friends. And so I'm really, really excited to get to talk to you today, Torrey. Hi.
Oh, that's so exciting to hear. That's really, I mean, mostly because I recognize that phenomenon, and yeah, it's very gratifying that my book would be one that does that. You know, I thank you for saying that.
Yes, I feel like, I don't know, a book that carries people's like reading life into their daily life and it opens up new doors for sort of talking with friends is, I don't know, who doesn't want that as a reader?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I had that. I've had that for a couple of books. I feel like the book that I always go to Ferrante.
Yeah.
Usually when I want to like ingratiate myself by doing that, where I'm like, oh, let's like have a thing that's like ours together, and I'll like be like, read this, and I'll be like, and I'll know that like, you know, 2 months later we'll have a thing. But yeah, it's the fact that it happened organically and not with like my kind of machinations with your club is really nice to hear.
I like the idea of sort of, I don't know, like greasing the tracks in that way though, and being like, are we going to talk about this? Let's see. Like, I think this is going to be a portal for us, and like finding out if someone responds or not. But I guess to start us off, I should ask you to read to us a little bit before I get to my million things I want to talk about.
Well, I was going to say, I was just going to, we'll get right into the conversation, but I was like, I feel like I also had books like that I would put on Tinder back when I was dating, where I'd be like, if I put this book on Tinder, we have a way of talking. And so like, anyway, but okay, I will read. I'm just going to read like the first couple of paragraphs of the book, kind of just for voice, and give people who haven't read it like a sense of what they're in for if they open the first page. The question for Reese: were married men just desperately attracted to her, or was the pool of men who were available to her as a trans woman only those who had already locked down a cis wife and could now explore with her? The easy answer, the one that all her girls advocated, was to call men dogs. But now here's Reese, sneaking around with another handsome, charming, motherfucking cheater. Look at her, wearing a black lace dress and sitting in his parked Beamer, waiting while he goes into Duane Reade to buy condoms. Then she's going to let him come over to her apartment, avoid the pointed glare of her roommate Iris, and have him fuck her right on the trite floral bedspread that the last married dude bought her, so that her room would seem a little more girly and naughty when he snuck away from his wife. Reese had already diagnosed her own problem. She didn't know how to be alone. She fled from her own company, from her own solitude. Along with telling her how awful her cheating men were, her friends also told her that after 2 major breakups, she needed time to learn to be herself, by herself. But she couldn't be alone in any kind of moderate way. Give her a week to herself and she began to isolate, cultivating an ash pile of loneliness that built on itself exponentially until she was daydreaming about selling everything and drifting away on a boat towards nowhere. To jolt herself back to life, she went on Grindr or Tinder or whatever and administered 10,000 volts to the heart by chasing the most dramatic tachycardia of an affair she could find. Married men were the best for fleeing loneliness because married men also didn't know how to be alone. Married men were experts at being together, at not letting go, no matter what, until death do us part. With the pretense of setting the boundaries of just an affair, Reese would swan dive super deep, super hard. By telling herself it would be just a fling, she gave herself permission to fulfill every fetish the guy had ever dreamed of, to unearth his every secret hurt, to debase herself in the most lush, vicious, and unsustainable ways, then collapse into resentment, sadness, and spite that had been just a fling, because hadn't she been brave enough and vulnerable enough to dive super deep, super hard? She saw herself as attractive, round face and full figure, but she didn't pretend that she stopped traffic, nor did she frequently note people standing around to admire the harvests of her brain. But with the right kind of man, she bore a genius for drama. She could distill it and flame it like jet fuel when solitude chilled her bones. Her man this time was similar to her others, a handsome, married alpha type who put her on a leash in the bedroom. Only this one was better because he was an HIV-positive cowboy turned lawyer. He had a thing for trans girls and had seroconverted while cheating on his wife with a trans woman, and the wife had stayed with him, and now he was at it again with Reese. Whee! Thanks.
Oh my God, Reese's voice is really what, I mean, and we're in third person, right? But her voice is so present in the narration. And I feel like the reader gets that right off the bat at the very beginning. And there's so much, sorry, my dog is heavy breathing. He is my new friend. But I feel like all bundled up in that beginning, there's so much strength and vulnerability that like, I don't know, it's like fluctuating, like one comes from the other, which makes the other impossible. Like, I don't know, could you talk about that with her character?
Yeah, I mean, Reese's voice is like sort of like the most catty, bitchy version of my own voice, you know, like pushing that, like really just leaning into it. And it took a while to sort of have like confidence with it. But I really wanted that to be right from the start. I mean, where for me, it also was a kind of like a little bit of a political thing where I wanted to announce right from the start, like, this is what you're going to get. Like on page 7, there's like a bug chasing, seroconversion, kink fetish play. And that Reese was going to be like, she wasn't always going to be likable. She was going to be messy. And, you know, if you don't like page 7, you're not going to like page like 284, you know, and like just to sort of like choose my readers with her voice. And so I actually think that like the first couple of pages, her voice is a little less vulnerable than it is elsewhere in the book because it was so like, I'm going to announce this, you know, and then to keep it up like that sort of much when you are on page like 250, it was a little bit like, no, I actually want her to be like a little bit more dynamic in how she feels. But I also think that like that is the idea that you can feel these ways, and that you can that you can have desires that are bad for you. I think a lot of Reese's desires are just, she wants things that aren't politically salient or politically palatable. She wants things that often make her feel worse, and that she isn't apologetic for wanting those things, even as like the narrative comes to show that those things, it doesn't matter if you want them or not want them, they do what they do. I wanted to announce that all from the start.
Yeah, I feel like so much of what you're talking about with desires is something that I know very well in life, and I see with friends, and I see in my life, but I don't see it on the page a lot, honestly, which makes most writing about relationships and about sex sometimes feel really disingenuous to me. I was reading a novel the other day where the characters went into the bedroom, and then the narrator who'd been like following those characters actually like stepped back and the door was closed in their face. And as a reader, I was like, come on, like, what are you doing? And so I don't know, I wonder what you think about what makes people, writers, sort of close the door on us as readers, and what does it mean to like open that door in a fictional space?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I've heard historically people say that like that the most erotic scene in fiction is in Madame Bovary, where like where they shut the door and then they open it again, and the bedroom is just like totally trashed, and you're like, oh my god, what did they get up to? Like this like the suggestion of it is so strong, and you just like put your own fantasy onto it. But that's certainly not what I do. I definitely leave the door open. And for me, there are a lot of writing about sex is sometimes people think it's like for the sex, and I think that when things are for the sex, that's when they're like, oh, is this actually just pornography? Like, but in most of the sex writing that I really like, it's actually about power. It's actually about like in sort of classic screenwriting, where there are the tips in screenwriting are like, somebody should always win the scene or something, like when you get like here's how to write like David Mamet or something. They'll be like, someone's always got to win the scene. And I actually think that like sex scenes are places to like really go back to the basics of power, of like, so and that sex is like always so much a negotiation of desire, and like, are you going to give somebody what they want? How are you going to give this person what they want? And then the other place that sex really brings out, that's so hard to talk about in other places, is shame. That like, if you have a life where you've spent a lot of time navigating and negotiating with shame, oftentimes in daily life, where we have learned how to do it. Like, we've learned how to hide. Like, I'm not ashamed of this, I'm not ashamed of that. I'm, especially as we've learned to sort of like deploy identities to be like, it's cool, I'm a proud like X type of person. It's in sex oftentimes that the shame reveals itself, and that you can't hide from it, and it's just like there in the body. And so for me, a lot of like what really powerful literature has done is describe and speak that shame, like, and not only just about trans stuff. I mean, there's a way in which I saw it happen in like various books by women, or even in sort of the classic kind of like phallic narcissist male writing too. They'll talk about their shame, and I'm like, oh, they've named it, and in some ways it like frees them. And for me, even though I'm writing about sex, I'm oftentimes usually writing about shame when I'm writing about sex. And if you can speak it and you can say it, then it doesn't seem so dire, because you're like, well, here it is on the page, whatever, and that both readers feel that, and me as a writer speaking shame usually frees me from it.
I love that so much. I feel like there's another moment in the book that's like a different kind of shame that I really identified my own shame in this moment where Ames on, it's, what is it, 154, where Ames is talking about not having legible traumas and sort of like that meaning that, I don't know, they feel like they can't sort of claim. It's this moment where, and without legible traumas to point to, what would pain make her? At best, a transversion of those Didion worshipping bourgeois white girls who subscribe to a grand unified theory of female pain, those minor wound-dwelling brooders with no particular difficulties, but for an inchoate sense of their own wrongedness. That moment, first, the language there is just, I could sing it all day. I love it so much. But I don't know, I wonder if you could talk about that line and that idea of like, what does it mean for a shame or a trauma to feel like illegible or not valid in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I go back and forth about whether I agree with like Ames and even myself in that. That's a reference to Leslie Jameson's essay, which, I thought that like 8 people were going to read this book when I wrote it. So I was like, I'll just talk shit about Leslie Jameson. Sure. Like, no one will ever read it. And
there's a lot of shade in this book and some of it
it's pretty shady.
And some of it is not hidden.
Yeah. The thing is I like Leslie Jameson, but I was just like, well, this is the thing I'm reading and it's informing ideas about womanhood and wounds it was like that was a moment, or that line is reflecting a moment where, I had spent so much of my childhood basically being like, you're fine, you're tough, you can do anything. And like, you don't have any real pain, you don't have any real trauma. And that if you want to feel sorry for yourself, you have to be a victim in some form, in order for it to be valid. And so I think that book is like that moment is like Ames realizing like, oh, actually, I have been in pain for many years. The pain is just not a pain that is like a known story. Like Ames's pain is that Ames had basically dissociated from himself for his entire childhood, like was so distant from his body, and that the pain was something that actually he wasn't in touch with, but it doesn't mean that he wasn't having pain. And suddenly, in discovering that he had been in pain, he felt entitled to all these feelings and entitled in some ways to victimhood. I think subsequent to that, and then maybe it's a little bit later in the book, I also wonder about like the logic of only victims get to feel entitled, or only if you've experienced trauma do you get to feel entitled to your pain, And I think that like actually a lot of toxic masculinity comes out of the fact that men don't see that logic. Men don't see themselves as being able to apply that logic to themselves, and so they can't ever acknowledge that they're in pain, and then they can't move through it, and they repeat it. Like I actually think that the victim narratives, as they're deployed, are, there's a way in which I would like to see us move past them and see. I mean, I didn't see the end of, I don't know, do you watch a television show, Euphoria?
I've spent most of this semester telling my students not to give me spoilers because I've only seen a tiny bit of it and I'm saving for spring break.
Well, I won't do it other than to
say things about Euphoria. I'm fine.
I'll say one thing about the Jacob Elordi, the Nate Jacobs or Nate whatever character, who is not in no way is that character a victim, and yet that character seems to be in pain, very bad pain, and it inflicts that pain on so many other people. And I think part of it is that there's no narrative to describe why that character is in pain, why that character is being such an asshole. And because and so then there's like, well, if that character is not a victim, that character's just an asshole, like how do you interrupt this kind of thing? So I actually think about that section that you just read, and this is not to like talk shit about my own book, but I'm ambivalent about it. Like whether that's actually, I think it's true for Ames. I wonder if it's true in a generalized sense.
This is the beauty of fiction, though. It's like it can be true for Ames, and you can sort of stick it out there and be like, let's see how I feel about this.
Absolutely. That's why I write fiction, because I don't want to, it's like, oh, that was just a character said that. You know?
I have used this line many times.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in the idea of like, what is it about a recognizable narrative that like both traps us and also like gives you a vehicle to be like, how can I interrupt this pain, for example? And I'm thinking about your dedication, which says, it talks about starting life over without reinvesting in the illusions from the past. I'm interested in that idea of like, what are the illusions that a person can sort of like let go of? Like, where do those illusions come from? And in my mind, I'm like, illusion is a story. Like, it's a story we tell ourselves about how things are supposed to be or who we're supposed to be. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so that dedication, just for people who haven't read it, is the book is dedicated to divorced cis women, and it's because while I was writing this book, I was reading a bunch of books by divorced cis women, or you know, at least about divorce, whether they're like Rachel Cusk or Elena Ferrante. And Sula isn't really exactly divorced, but it's like kind of break up and getting up on men story. And I was really just relating to them. I was like, these women, they know how to ask these questions that matter to me as a trans woman. And I began to think that like, okay, actually the like arc of a transition, or at least my transition, and the arc of a divorce are very similar, where you live your life a certain way, you've got these illusions about how it is, and then there's like a break or a failure. And then after that break or failure, you have to start over. And if you reinvest in the illusions, well, then you're going to repeat those mistakes. If you think like, oh, I'm going to have a man who is my Prince Charming and he's going to like come in and save me and make my womanhood complete or whatever, you're going to marry probably an asshole, and you're going to get divorced again in like, 5 to, let's say 2 to 10 years. I'll give it 2 to 10 years. And then you're going to be back where it is. So you can't get stuck in that place. You have to, but also the other risk is that you're like, oh, I'm wised up, I know better. And then you become bitter and you don't try again, and you get stuck in a sort of bitterness. And so reading these divorce stories, I was like, oh, you have to thread this needle between trying again, never getting stuck, and not getting super bitter. And I think that a lot of this book, for me, is about being stuck, is about like, Reese is telling herself the same stories over and over about, if only I had a man this way, then I would feel, in this traditional sense, then I would feel complete. Ames is like, if only I could like connect with my gender, my life would be fine. Katrina's like, if only I could have, if I could have a relationship and find a kind of reason for why the first ones failed, then I would be complete. But in fact, like, so much of those narratives and the way that they repeat are just coping mechanisms that each of these characters do. And not to be like a spoiler on this book, but like, I see the structure of the book as like, at the beginning of the book, they're kind of at the same place where they are at the end of the book. Like, it's like they're in a room and they're like, should we have a baby together? And sorry to everybody, but the ending's not going to satisfy you anyway, so I'm just going to tell you what it is that they're back in that same spot. And the journey that they've gone on isn't one of, okay, we've made a bunch of action and whatever. Although I like to think that there's action in the book, what that action achieves is it strips away their coping mechanism. It strips away the narratives that they tell themselves. It strips away the lies and the self-delusions, until at the end, what they have to ask themselves at the end is the same thing that they have to ask themselves at the beginning, only now they can't be delusional about it. And I say that as somebody who like is very prone to self-mythologizing, very prone to like telling myself satisfying stories about who I am and what my actions mean, and you know, why whatever conviction I have at the moment is the right conviction. And usually the process that I have to go through is like, what would it mean to ask the questions that matter to my life in a completely honest way? It's to be like just totally stripped down, you know. And I think about this a lot with trans women, because on one hand, trans women we're the first generation where we have a certain horizon, like what we have, where there's all these possibilities. And at the same time, a lot of times you make one big decision as a trans woman, you're going to transition. And it's so fucking hard that then you don't make any more decisions. And you just sort of live in that moment of like, well, I did it, I transitioned. And part of what the book was challenging, at least trans readers to do, was like, okay, you did it once, and now you have to do it again. Now you just look, you stripped away all the lies that made you able to transition. Now you're gonna have to strip away all the lies you've told yourself to cope with transition in order to move forward and be like a whole person. And then after that, you're gonna like, you know, more lies are gonna accrete over time, and you're gonna have to strip those away. And it's a constant, ongoing, painful process that is like being alive. And you don't get to make one decision. You don't get to have a divorce and have it be over. You don't get to transition and have it be over. You're gonna have to do it again. And those are the illusions. The illusions that it's ever gonna stop, and that or that you've cracked it. I mean, I think there's a lot of different types of illusions, but those, maybe that's just even where I'm at right now. Like, you know, like I've had this like success with this book, and I'm like, I did it. And then I'm like, why is everything not, why is it not nirvana, you know?
Because the Buddhist way is that you have to keep doing it like it's the first time over
keep
and over.
Suffering. Yeah.
No, I relate to that so hard. And I think that the part of it that gets tricky and dangerous is when you are good at telling yourself those stories, that it's easy to convince yourself, and here's the resolution at the end. I actually have a group of friends who, when I tell them things about my life, they're allowed to tell me like, here's a story you are telling yourself. We see how you're zhuzhing it up. We see how you're doing it. And that's helpful. But I'm glad you spoiled the ending, so I don't have to feel bad about doing it. But I think there's something in the end where, by not resolving the baby, it's like Schrodinger's baby at the end. And like by not resolving it, it recenters the adults, and it recenters their need to be like, a baby is not like, whether the baby comes, the baby does not come, like you have to figure out your shit. Like that seems like a really bold narrative choice. I wonder, you just said maybe people would find it unsatisfying. Have people been yelling about the ending because they wanted to see a happy baby arrive?
I mean, if you make the mistake of reading Goodreads reviews, sure, like people which I have made that mistake of doing. But you know, I think that most people who get what I'm doing like the ending. They find it has purpose. Why I wrote it that way. You know, some people have definitely they've wanted a prescription. They wanted to be like, okay, so if you're sad in these ways, you know, form an alternative family, and then your problems are solved. And you know, part of the thing is that I think, and this is where, you know, half of it I'm writing for trans women, but half of it is sort of like a generational thing where, you know, you read these essays and you have these things that are in the culture, like heteropessimism, right? Where it's like everybody's pessimistic about heterosexuality, and yet also not everybody is queer, and not everybody can just like, you know, oh well, I don't like men, so I'll date women or whatever, and a lot of this. And then meanwhile, queers are like, well, just because we got marriage doesn't mean that like we should all want to get married. And so I think that there's a kind of like generational moment where we're all posing these questions about what is life going to look like now. And I think that, you know, a lot of straight women are asking these kinds of questions, like, is heterosexuality as it functions as an institution the thing that's going to bring me joy? And then what I left it open for is like, I don't actually know. Like, I don't know how to solve this stuff. Maybe the answer is to form a triad and raise a baby so that your gender feels right. But maybe it's just that an acknowledgement that the institutions that we've relied on and that have functioned to varying results for 100 years or 200 years should be rethought, or at least there should be the freedom to, like, if marriage works for you, great, go get married. Like, a lot of Reese's desires are very in some ways conservative desires, and if that's the thing that brings you joy, go do it. But a lot of times Reese things weren't working because Reese wanted that stuff to bring her joy, and it didn't. And so the end of the book for me is about sort of putting it back on the readers and being like, okay, what this book is a description of the problem, and what you have to do is go solve it for yourself. An articulation of the problem.
Yeah, I think there's a way in which like alternative family novels, which are a thing that I love a lot, and I'm really excited. I teach a class on, it goes in scare quotes, like the dysfunctional family novel, which is like, spoilers, it's all families. But I'm really excited to teach this book next year. But in the past, I've taught Michael Cunningham's Home at the End of the World. And because the way the class works, it's like we read half on Tuesday, we read the second half on Thursday. The students all come in, they're like 18, and they come in on Tuesday and they're like, this is it, like they're gonna have this baby together and it's gonna be great, and they're all in love in different ways, and like this is the future. And I'm like, I'll see you on Thursday. And they're so disappointed. But I think it's that same thing where it's like, maybe that is the structure that works for a person, but like that's not going to be like a panacea for everyone. And so not letting the reader off the hook, I think, is really powerful. So I'm supposed to turn it over to other questions, but I'm going to ask you one more question before. And this is also like a notice to people on YouTube that if you're scheming about questions, now would be a great time to post them so that we can go to them. I have to know about the fictional real people in this book. So there's like fictional Sarah Jessica Parker, there's fictional Zach Morris, and my personal favorite, fictional Werner Herzog. And I just wondered, like, was it just very fun? It seems like it was just very fun to do. And I just wanted to ask you about that.
I have like a high answer to that question and a low answer to that question. Like the high answer to that question is like, post 80s or 90s postmodernism, when you have like David Foster Wallace writing stories about, all sorts of political figures, or you have Don DeLillo writing about, I'm blanking on his name, the person who killed Kennedy, Oswald, and things like that. Like where like suddenly pop figures from culture are just like that, you can use them, and it's like to not use them feels like to go back. It's like that Pandora's box has been opened where everybody is potentially a fictional character, and I think autofiction is essentially also sort of a piece of that. So that's like the highfalutin answer, is that I think that we're just in an era where that is the material around us. But the more fun answer is that like I kind of wanted to do that in a just gossipy way, like that there's such a pleasure in gossip, and like instead of like what does it mean to like be inside the mind of like Lee Harvey Oswald, I'm just going to stick Sarah Jessica Parker in the dress and like say this about her. I'm gonna and then the really gossipy thing is that most of those things, about half of them, are my just celebrity encounters in New York. Like I met Werner Herzog, and it was in New Hampshire. I met him, and he was on the porch of this house, and he told me two things. He told me first that he had seen a deer this morning, and he had like looked into its stupid animal eyes or something like that, in like a completely Werner Herzog way, where he's like, I saw its dumb animal eyes, and our gazes were fixed, and I was like, okay, wow, you're like, do you just do this? Is this like your thing? Like, do not know when the camera's like, I have no camera. But and then the second thing he told me was that he was in New Hampshire because he had been at a hotel in New York, and there had been bed bugs in the hotel. So he told me, if this ever happens to you, he said the same thing that's in the book. You have to put your clothes in the freezer and like freeze the vermin, down, whatever. And I was like, well, so much of this book is like kind of in and out of reality. Like the character of Talia is, anyone who's in like queer Brooklyn can probably like recognize who that is. And I was like, well, if I'm gonna put my friend in the book, maybe I'll just put Werner Herzog in the book too. And then I had actually gone to the GLAAD Awards and seen Sarah Jessica Parker. So I was like, sure, I'll put Sarah Jessica Parker in the book. And then Sarah Jessica Parker put the book in the new show. So it was like, that means that Carrie, played by Sarah Jessica Parker, has read that she is a fictional character, right? Because there's like Sex and the City problem, had her mind like blown, knows that she doesn't exist, and has the key to her own non-existence above her bed in the show there. So I was just like, basically to do that, Sarah Jessica Parker has a good sense of humor, because it wasn't like that flattering a depiction of her, but she was just like, this is funny. I'm going to put the book in my show. And so
and that's
it is funny.
Inception. It's like a fictional, non-fictional Inception vortex.
Right. And that's what I think is like really fun about doing these pop characters, is because pop culture people are, in some ways, pop culture figures are somewhat narcissistic, and we live in an era of Instagram where like Lee Harvey Oswald would never put the book of Lee Harvey Oswald on his nightstand, but Sarah Jessica Parker would put it on Carrie's nightstand and stuff. I thought nobody would read this book, and instead I'm like conjuring. You can like, in this era, you can like conjure the celebrities you want to talk to in fiction. It's a weird moment.
It is a weird moment. The idea of writing something where you feel like no one's going to read it. I know things about that. And then like once you realize people might read it, it's hard to go back to that place. I kind of think personally that you have to sort of pretend you're still in that place. I don't know. How do you feel about that?
I'm currently in Colombia. Like if you look out the window, I can't really see it, but that's Santa Marta. I'm in Santa Marta, and I basically ran away to Colombia to feel like nobody cares about me. Especially because so many of my books are like a little bit gossipy, like to feel like I could gossip and make jokes that are, not that they're not like perfectly kind jokes always. Or as you say, the book can be shady. And when I was writing it, I thought like, I have 12 friends who are going to cackle when they read this line, and that the subjects of the lines will never see themselves, and suddenly they do. And I felt actually very not brave writing my new stuff, because I felt like, oh shit, like if I say something about somebody, they might actually read it. And so now everything will be safe. And I feel like I had to go away to write some stuff that like isn't safe again.
Yeah, that idea of physical distance, it's like New York is such a writer's mecca, LA is such a writer's mecca, but there's a way that it feels really claustrophobic and limiting sometimes too. I live in like a very rural village, and like I'm always trying to get back to the city, but then also there's something nice about being here. I promised myself I would let myself, and by the way, I haven't seen questions yet. I have one from people to bring up, but there's a line that made me laugh harder than most things in this life. And so I just wanted to ask you about humor, and sort of like dark humor and gallows humor, but it's the moment at the doTERRA party If an oracle had foretold that Reese would voluntarily come out at a doTERRA essential oils direct sales party, she would have understood it figuratively, a puzzle like the one the witches gave to fool Macbeth, because the literal possibility of a forest traveling up a hill existed beyond the realms of even outlandish farce. A doTERRA party coming out is Reese's Burnham Wood. I mean, like, talk about jokes that have a very specific audience. Like, there's probably a lot of people who laugh, but if there is an audience, like, hi. I don't know. Can you talk about humor? Like, are there writers that you find funny or comedians that like really make you laugh? Like, what is icons of comedy for you?
I mean, I think specificity is oftentimes what is funny, you know. And it also, I mean, part of it is also like owning who I am, especially like writing this trans book, that like so much stuff is like, oh, you're speaking on behalf of all trans women. So if I make a joke about like, oh, I really wish I had a KitchenAid mixer or something like that, to like with the pasta attachments, you know, or if I say like the trans woman's like highest calling is to have a KitchenAid mixer with the pasta attachments, people are like, you know, some trans women are, you know, living in poverty, whatever, you can imagine the various ways in which. And so there's a way in which like by basically being like, this is what I'm saying, like this is so wrong and so in some ways like materialistic and stupid, then I'm naming who I am, and all of the jokes I can make fun of myself. I have the freedom to not sort of represent and to just like let those jokes be what they are, and like other people can make their jokes. So I think in some ways like humor is like a really sharp way of defining who you are, and also like shoving off like a lot of the responsibilities and things that other people put on you that maybe you don't want. And so that's like sort of like a lot of the purpose of it for me. But then yeah, like the humor is so specific. Like, you know, tragedies, people talk about tragedy being kind of universal, but like there's a lot of jokes that like, you know, if 8 people will get if you make them. And I love those jokes, and I love being like led in on them. Like not just in subcultures I know, but like subcultures I don't know. Like when there's like a joke and I'm like, I don't understand the codes of that joke, and then suddenly I like look into it and I'm like, oh, that's why that joke is funny. And I never would have known. Suddenly I feel like I understand something about other people that would have taken otherwise, you know, weeks of trying to like parse it. But the jokes like work on a weird click. And if you can like see how the click comes together, you can understand so much. And so they're so useful for conveying massive amounts of information in tiny spaces. Things that like writers that I think are funny. I just read Elif Batuman's new book, and I think Elif Batuman is so funny. And she's just sort of like, her humor is super nerdy. And I guess I have a very nerdy sense of humor sometimes. I think that's very funny. You know, I read, do you know who Charles Portis is?
Oh, by name only, but yeah.
Like all these funny writers I know, I've been like, Charles Portis is a very funny writer. Like Dog of the South is like one of his books. He's this like Southern writer from he sort of feels like Hunter Thompson, but like less show-offy or something. And I was reading his book and I was like, and everything in this book is so deadpan, just like ridiculous things, like ridiculous statements said so deadpan. And it was like a type of humor that I was like, I want to do this someday. I want to tell a book that's like an entire, just like ridiculous, like picaresque by a narrator who has absolutely no sense of humor about himself as he's doing this completely like absurd things where he's like, and that's, you know, like it's just so funny. I mean, it's like offensive. Like the book in some ways doesn't age well in terms of like its references. You're like, this is like, you know, politically it's not very like on point, but in terms of just like like the sentences and the way they unroll in this deadpan way, I was like, this is so good to me. So I'll just say that was a very, very funny book to me. I'll say one more actually, because I love books. I read Haldor, in a very similar way, Haldor Laxness's Independent People, which is the Icelandic book about sheep farming that won the Nobel. It's like 600 pages about sheep farming. It won the Nobel in 1952. And you open it up and you're like, this is the most boring book I've ever read. It's just like farmers complaining about how their sheep are sick and like sort of like outdoing each other with like, oh, my sheep has the worst diarrhea. and like pages and pages of it. And you're like, why is this? This book is terrible. Like, it won the Nobel. And then there's like something that happened where I suddenly realized it was funny, that these complaints were like ridiculous, and that like everything that was being said was like so over the top and very humane. Just like these people were ridiculous, and the author loved these ridiculous people and had such compassion for them. And then the book was the most enjoyable book, where I was like, this 600 pages about ridiculous sheep farmers are an absolute joy. I don't know, what are your favorite funny books? I know this is like, I'm supposed to talk about myself, but swapping funny books is my favorite.
Oh my God, I love that. Do you know what cracked me up? And it's like a totally tragic book. And yet sometimes I tell my students when I sign a story, I'm like, this story is so funny. And they're like, how many people die? Because at this point, they distrust my humor. But Women Talking by Miriam Tobes. Have you read it?
I've not. Everybody tells me to read it, but no one's told me it's funny. And now that I know it's funny, I would love to read it.
It's so funny. It's like this. So the women are illiterate, and so they have to.
Hilarious already.
But they get this hapless boy from the like Mennonite collective to take the minutes of their meeting because they're trying to vote if they need to leave or not for very traumatic reasons. And the poor hapless kid who's writing it down is always writing things down. They're like, you're doing it wrong. And he's like, you can't read. And they're like, we still know you're doing it wrong. And it's just the way that they bicker with each other. And they're all so smart in different ways. And they're all right. And they're all wrong. And this kid is just trying to take it down. There's something about it that just brings me, I just laugh. I laugh and laugh and laugh. And it's like rooted in that place of darkness. And I think that's what really sets me off.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask you about, I'm still looking at the chat just in case someone sends a question. This is me trolling for questions from the audience, which I know involves some of my students and friends who could ask questions. But I love, and this sounds like a weird thing to say, but I've just admitted that I'm morbid. But the funeral scene, Tammy's funeral scene, is one of the most, the moments in the book that I really just vibed with so intensely. And I think this breakdown that Reese does of why she goes to funerals, and this idea of funerals remind Reese not to kill herself, not because she so badly wants to live, because suicide as a trans girl leads to a mortifying posthumous stripping of all that you cherish by friends and strangers alike. If you are not there to stop them, the loudest, brashest, and clumsiest of your semi-acquaintances will scoop up all that was once you and simmer it down to a single mawkish narrative, plucking out all that is inconveniently irreducible and inserting in its place all that it is trite and politically serviceable. And then there's really cool play with the word mortifying, but this idea, I mean, this is so funny and so dark all at once. And it's so, I'm so interested in this idea of like, what does it mean for your story to be reduced in a way? And the idea of like motivation for living being like, no, you will not boil it down to whatever it is. I don't know, could you talk about narratives? Reducible narratives?
Yeah, I mean, those actually came from funerals that I went to. You know, like that feeling came from funerals I went to, where trans women, mostly killed themselves, and I went to the funerals, and the funerals are really contested places. Like, people would say, like, the funeral was like a time for people to say like, well, this is why the trans woman died, because of this or that, and or like either they're not getting enough or being trans is wrong or whatever it is. a lot of it was well-meaning, but I remember just being in the audience and being like, if somebody talked about me this way, like I would, if this was my story, if this is what my legacy is, what these people are saying, like I would come back from the grave just to spite them, you know? And there's a way in which I think we have, I'm gonna sound like a total crank right now, but I just read this book it was by John Hari about, it's called Stolen Focus. I read these like quasi self-help books, but this one's about how the internet is like stealing our focus or whatever. But what I really was interested about is the ways in which there used to be a lot of different ways for people to be transphobic. Like it used to be like we used to be like, oh, the religious right, they hate trans people for this reason, or like TERFs, they hate trans people for this reason, or whatever. And there's a way in which like all these narratives are becoming one narrative, if that makes sense, like because it's the one that gets promoted by like algorithms and things. This is where I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but like, I mean, Patricia Lockwood was talking about this recently too, where she was like, my dad used to be a very specific asshole. Like the way he was an asshole was like very unique to him. He spent years learning how to be an asshole. And now he's an asshole just like everybody else. All the other like boomer dudes in their 60s are assholes, quoting Pizzagate and doing whatever. And I'm really interested in like the ways in which and the flip side of this is that what's happening is I'm like, oh, there's becoming one way of being a transphobe, but there's also becoming one way of being a trans woman, where it used to be like there were all these different reasons why people transitioned. They came from all these different subcultures and did all these, all these different things. And now the reasons why you transition have become a single narrative. They've been like, and it's like, here's what your politics are if you're trans. Here's what your experience is. Here's what your motivation is. And I'm kind of interested in how that's happening and how to push back on that. Like, there's a way in which I've been saying this thing recently, which is meant to be provocative, where it's like, I'm not sure that trans women exist. And by that, I mean, like, obviously I exist, but trans women as they are understood and mediated in the world, the narrative of trans women, I'm not sure that that person exists, that trans woman. And by the same token, like, I'm not sure that transphobes exist in the ways that happens. I'm gonna shut this door real fast because I bet you're hearing a lot of water.
I think I'm thinking about humor again and specificity. And it's like when you draw a line around something, that makes it like a protected real thing. Like we drew a line around this, it exists, it's real.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this is sort of way, maybe this is far afield, but in Paul Beatty's The Sellout, there's that town Dickens that's been unincorporated. And in order to make the town exist and for the town to get resources, it must be reincorporated. But the only way to make Dickens exist is he turns it into, the character in the book turns it into this crazy town of racial stereotypes, because then it's in the news and it like convenes to images people want to see about Black people. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, this is a real place. And they draw a line around it again.
Yeah.
And the last line of the book is something like Dickens is back on the map. And it's like bittersweet because you're like, yep, you made a space for this, but now it has to happen this one way that has nothing to do with the people who live there.
That is a great illustration of this. Probably better than my like cranky, I don't like the internet version of it.
The algorithms are real.
The algorithms are after me. Here's a beautiful literary example, Torrey. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I mean, I thought a lot about, I read a lot about like speech act theory to like, to be like, how is this actually working with the Austinian, whatever. So if people are, I won't go into it because I think it's not good conversation fodder, but I was interested in like what becomes a felicitous speech act to make these things go, and why these things, why certain ideas or stereotypes get so sticky, and is there like opportunity for me as like an author to like gum up the works a little bit, like Paul Beatty did, you know, or to like reveal the workings of it. It's and sometimes when I'm really irritated, it usually means it's just like very fertile ground somewhere around.
I also write from a place of irritation and sometimes even spite.
Yeah, so I'm all about negative emotions while writing. I really think that they're very useful. Just because seems like a free-flowing conversation. I watched the documentary about Michael Jordan. Did you see that?
I haven't seen that, no.
He's so spiteful and petty. And I was like, maybe he's great because he's just so petty. Like that, like pettiness is what like allowed him to like dig so deep and like pull up something incredible. Like there was he would manufacture it. Like there was a final series of I don't know, I guess he was playing the Trailblazers or something. And he goes to the restaurant and the other coach is there. And the coach doesn't come over to his table to say hi. And so he's like, I was snubbed. That guy snubbed me at dinner. And I'm going to show him that you can't snub me. And he like just was incredible for like played like, you know, the entire game, was not tired. Every time he made a basket, he like pointed in the coach's face and was like, that's what you get. And the coach was like, what did I? Like, I didn't even do it. And I sometimes wonder about like spite and pettiness being the thing that like pushes you to go to a place that you otherwise wouldn't be brave enough to do, or you'd sit down, or you say that you're tired or whatever. But and you know, maybe it's why writing is such lonely work, but it does seem like a negative, like that sometimes the maligned negative places are actually like places of real fruitfulness.
Yeah, because you can bounce against them. There's a sense of like, there are things that I don't think I care strongly about. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh no, wait, like I feel a way about this, or I feel the opposite of that. And that wouldn't get pulled out of me if I didn't have that. I mean, I'm sure other people are beautiful and well-adjusted and are just like, I know my opinions and I say them out loud, but like, I don't have that ability. So I think I want to be the Michael Jordan of spiteful success.
Yeah, we're just two dysfunctional, hateful people having a conversation.
Thank you for coming. Yeah. I know we have to wrap up soon, but I have one last question, which is, I just want to know about your motorcycle.
Oh.
And how you've come to be a motorcycle person.
You know, it was useful, like as a sort of like symbol, but it was that, and when I moved to New York, I felt very meek. I felt like I was like, you know, it was like I would be on the street and people would like say something to me and I'd be like, oh, I don't want to take up too much space. I don't want to attract attention to myself. And I was just like, you didn't used to be meek, Torrey. Like, why are you suddenly so meek? And my solution to it was to just get this like giant motorcycle. Because I was like, well, if I'm riding a motorcycle, I'm taking up space. Like they're loud, they're like whatever. And then the other thing is that if people come to talk to me while I have a motorcycle, previously people would talk about how I looked or like, you know, things that made me uncomfortable on the street. Or that was also what I really was looking to avoid, which is why I was so like small. But when you have a motorcycle, people mostly want to talk to you about your motorcycle. You know, they're like, so it was like this like thing that was so big and just took up so much space, and I could sort of be with it and interact with people and not be kind of afraid, but also have this kind of conversational and attentional shield. And then when, of course, it was this black motorcycle, and all these guys were like, oh, is that your boyfriend's bike? Like, did you, you know, like he let you take it out or something? And I was like so annoyed by that I painted it pink to basically be like, this is my bike. Like I drive a giant pink motorcycle. And then it's one of those things where like each step along the way makes sense, but soon you're like the person in all pink driving a giant motorcycle around Williamsburg. And you're like, no, everybody, it made sense. Every single step along the way made sense. But now this is just who I am, you know? It was like at some point I was thinking about getting a dog, and I was like, well, how will I carry the dog? And I was like, well, probably the motorcycle. And if the dog's on the motorcycle, I probably need goggles. And like suddenly I'm gonna be like the lady with like a small dog wearing matching pink goggles riding around the motorcycle. And like every step of the way, I'm like, it's just the logical conservative thing to do, you know?
This is the best slippery slope I've ever heard of. Oh my gosh, I'm so grateful to you that I got to talk to you. I'm grateful for your book and for your work and your energy, which is such a light. And thank you so much for coming, and thank you all for tuning in. I don't know if NCLA wants to say things here at the end, but I've really enjoyed sharing this time.
Thank you so much, CJ and Torrey. That was really brutally honest chat, and it was good to get into Reese's voice. And I loved where the conversation went from writing to Sarah Jessica Parker to sheep farmers and motorcycles and so on from there. And it was, thank you so much. I just want to conclude tonight by saying that the next NCLA event is March 9th with a Pulitzer Prize winner, Ann Boyer, in conversation with Mark Byers. So we'll see you again, and thank you both so much.
Thank you.